Taboo facts from the Middle Ages you won't believe are true. Number 1. The medieval tooth fairy was actually just your blacksmith. The Middle Ages were all about multitasking. Blacksmiths weren't just for horseshoes and swords. They doubled as dentists. Nothing says trusted professional like a guy who spends all day hammering molten iron. Dentistry was a lot like a horror movie. No anesthetics, no hygiene, and tools that looked more at home in a torture chamber than a medical office. Losing teeth was like a rite of passage. The only difference? You didn't get a quarter under your pillow, you just got a gaping hole in your smile. Fun fact, medieval tooth extraction was so intense that sometimes people didn't survive the experience. But hey, at least they didn't have to worry about cavities anymore. To deaden the pain, patients were given strong alcoholic drinks. So technically, the first shot of vodka was your medieval anesthetic. Many people believe that a worm caused tooth decay, which raises the question, why didn't they just use the worm to fish for new teeth? If you were rich, you might get a replacement tooth made of ivory or bone. If you were poor, well, let's just say gap-toothed grin was a popular look. In some places, barbers would also handle your teeth. And if they messed up, they could just shave you bald to make you feel better. The best cure for a toothache? Tie a frog to your jaw. Or, at least that's what they thought. Maybe they were just desperate for a French kiss? Despite all this, people in the Middle Ages actually ate less sugar than we do today. So really, who's laughing now? 2. The plague wasn't just a disease, it was a lifestyle. The Black Death wiped out about 30 to 60% of Europe's population. That's like if your favorite social media app deleted half of its users overnight. Talk about thinning the herd. People thought the plague was God's punishment, so they started whipping themselves in the streets to show they were really sorry. Guess they didn't get the memo that no pain, no gain wasn't meant to be taken literally. The cure for the plague? Bloodletting. Because when you're already dying, why not speed up the process by draining all your blood? The rats and fleas that spread the plague had the best PR team in history. They've been blamed for the Black Death for centuries. Meanwhile, poor sanitation was just lurking in the shadows, quietly doing its dirty work. In some towns, entire families were sealed inside their homes to prevent the plague from spreading. A little medieval quarantine, complete with rats and rotting food. Some people thought smelling something really bad would protect them from the plague. So, they carried around bouquets of flowers to sniff, which is where we get the nursery rhyme, Ring Around the Rosie. Doctors wore those creepy beaked masks filled with herbs. They looked like plague-fighting birdmen, which, admittedly, is a pretty metal way to do your rounds. There were plague pits, where bodies were dumped en masse because digging individual graves just wasn't practical when you've got a whole town's worth of dead bodies to deal with. Believe it or not, some people actually made money off the plague. Grave robbers had a field day, and people sold fake miracle cures. Never underestimate medieval capitalism. The Black Death ended up giving survivors a lot more job opportunities because, well, there weren't a lot of people left to do the work. Silver lining? 3. The feudal system, where you could literally own people. Imagine your boss not just owning your time at work, but also literally owning you and everything you own. Welcome to the Middle Ages. Serfs were basically human cows, tied to the land and passed along to whoever owned the land. Moving up the social ladder was not an option. If you were a peasant, you spent your whole life working the land, but the land was never yours. So, basically, medieval life was one long unpaid internship. Feudal lords could demand anything from their serfs, from crops to manual labor to, occasionally, weird personal services like, I need you to dance around in a chicken suit. The idea of taking a day off was as foreign as Wi-Fi in a medieval castle. Sundays were for church, not Netflix binges. You couldn't just pack up and leave. Serfs were as glued to the land as your mom is to her Facebook account. If a serf wanted to marry, they needed their lord's permission. So, feudal lords were basically medieval Tinder, but without the swiping. Lords often kept the best land for themselves and gave the scraps to the serfs. Sharing is caring apparently hadn't caught on yet. When the lord went to war, serfs had to go too, armed with nothing but pitchforks and sheer terror. They were medieval cannon fodder, literally. Despite being the backbone of medieval society, serfs were at the bottom of the social pyramid. They were essential, but about as appreciated as that little plastic thing in a pizza box. 4. The Crusades. When Europe went on a giant road trip for God. The Crusades were basically a massive, centuries-long road trip where knights and peasants alike packed up and headed to the Holy Land. Except, instead of souvenirs, they brought back trauma and debt. Pope Urban II promised those who went on crusade that they'd have all their sins forgiven. It was like a get-out-of-hell-free card, but with more swords and less monopoly money. Crusaders were often younger sons who wouldn't inherit land, so they went to the Holy Land hoping to score some real estate. It was the medieval version of flipping houses. The First Crusade was a surprising success. The knights took Jerusalem, and instead of writing postcards, they massacred the city's inhabitants. #Holy Massacre. Not all crusaders were knights in shining armor. Many were just peasants with a dream. a pitchfork, and a woeful lack of combat training. The Children's Crusade was the medieval equivalent of kids these days. Thousands of children marched to the Holy Land, only to be sold into slavery. Parenting advice: don't let your kids go on unsupervised religious quests. The Crusades were an excellent opportunity for knights to show off their best armor and most righteous indignation. Think of it as a medieval Comic-Con, but with more bloodshed. Saladin, the Muslim leader, was so respected by the Christians that they treated him like a medieval celebrity. Think of him as the Brad Pitt of the battlefield. Some Crusaders never made it to the Holy Land. Instead, they decided to sack Christian cities along the way. It was like setting out for Disneyland and ending up looting the local mall. By the end of the Crusades, everyone was tired, broke, and the Holy Land was still a mess. It's almost as if centuries of warfare weren't the best solution. Go figure. 5. The medieval church, where heaven met corruption. The medieval church was like a holy superpower. More influence than Instagram, more wealth than Jeff Bezos, and enough power to make or break kings. The Pope had the ultimate trump card: excommunication. It's like blocking someone on social media, but instead of missing your posts, they'd miss out on heaven. Selling indulgences was the medieval church's version of microtransactions. Want to shave off some time in purgatory? Just slip the church a few coins, and you're good to go. The church had a monopoly on knowledge, which meant that most people were as illiterate as a garden gnome. The Bible was in Latin, so understanding it was like trying to read IKEA instructions without the pictures. Monks and nuns lived a life of prayer, chastity, and boredom, but they were also the medieval equivalent of Wikipedia. They copied books by hand, because, printing presses were still just a twinkle in Gutenberg's eye. Some monasteries were incredibly wealthy. They had more bling than a rapper's Instagram, and their lands produced enough food to feed an army, literally. The church didn't just deal in spiritual matters. They ran schools, hospitals, and were the biggest landowners in Europe. So, basically, the church was your one-stop shop for salvation, education, and real estate. The Inquisition was the church's way of dealing with heretics. It was less about asking questions and more about introducing you to the business end of Iraq. Pilgrimages were a big deal. They were like religious road trips, except the souvenirs were relics, not shot glasses. And sometimes the relics were just random bones from the local graveyard. But hey, it's the thought that counts. Bishops and abbots were often as corrupt as politicians. They buy their positions, hoard wealth, and, in some cases, have mistresses. But hey, nobody's perfect, right? 6. Medieval medicine. When the cure was often worse than the disease. If you thought modern medicine was bad, medieval medicine was like playing Russian roulette with a loaded syringe. Bloodletting was the go-to cure for everything. Got a headache? Let's drain some blood. Got the plague? More bloodletting. Sneezed twice in a row? Better get the leeches. Surgery was done without anesthetics, so patients were awake and screaming. It was basically a medieval horror movie, except it was your life. Amputation was the solution to many problems. Infection? Chop it off. Broken bone? Chop it off. Stubbed toe? You guessed it, chop it off. If you had a fever, the doctor might prescribe a nice warm dose of mercury, because nothing says healing like poisoning yourself. Herbal remedies were all the rage. Some worked, like willow bark for pain, but others were just medieval guesswork. Spoiler alert, unicorn horn powder didn't actually cure anything. Medical knowledge was based on the 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. It was like a really gross version of Pokemon, and you definitely didn't want to catch them all. Physicians often relied on astrology to diagnose illnesses. If the stars weren't aligned, your liver might just be in retrograde. Hospitals were more like waiting rooms for the afterlife. The care wasn't great, but at least you got a nice, hard bed and some holy water before you kicked the bucket. Despite the medieval medical madness, some people actually survived. But let's be real, those were the lucky ones who just avoided doctors altogether. 7. Medieval knights, chivalry, chainmail, and a lot of bloodshed. Knights weren't just noble warriors, they were medieval celebrities. They had more fans than your favorite TikTok star, and were just as likely to get involved in drama. The code of chivalry was like the medieval bro code, except with more stabbing and fewer fist bumps. Training to be a knight started early, around age 7, when boys were sent to live with another noble family. It was like boarding school, but with more sword fights and fewer math tests. Knights wore armor that could weigh up to 60 pounds. So, basically, they were walking, talking tanks with bad peripheral vision. Jousting was the medieval equivalent of extreme sports. 2 knights would charge at each other with lances, and the winner got bragging rights, a shiny trophy, and possibly a concussion. Being a knight was expensive. You needed armor, weapons, horses, and a small fortune to fund it all. So, think of it as the medieval version of owning a supercar. Despite the romantic image, knights were often brutal. They didn't just fight in wars. They also pillaged, looted, and generally made life miserable for peasants. Damsels in distress? More like damsels in disappointment. Knights often had mistresses and weren't exactly the picture of marital fidelity. If a knight was captured in battle, he could be ransomed back to his family. So, technically, being a knight was like playing a very expensive game of Pokemon. Gotta catch 'em all. Tournaments were more than just sports. They were opportunities to show off, make connections, and possibly get killed by an overzealous opponent. So, a lot like modern-day reality TV. 8. Medieval fashion. Because who doesn't love wearing 20 pounds of fabric? Fashion in the Middle Ages was less about comfort and more about showing off your status. If you were rich, you wore as much fabric as possible, because nothing says, "I'm wealthy," like suffocating under 20 pounds of velvet. Sumptuary laws dictated what you could wear based on your social status. So, basically, if you were a peasant and tried to wear purple, you'd get fined. Purple was for royalty, not for your backyard mud wrestling sessions. Pointy shoes were all the rage for men. The longer the point, the cooler you were. Some shoes were so long they had to be tied to the wearer's knees, because tripping over your own feet was apparently the height of fashion. Women's hairstyles were elaborate and often involved fake hairpieces, because nothing says, "I'm fashionable," like wearing someone else's hair on your head. Corsets weren't just for the Victorians. Medieval women wore tight-fitting garments that made breathing optional. Fashion tip: always choose fainting over comfort. Fur was a big deal, and the richer you were, the more exotic the fur. Peasant? You got sheep's wool. Noble? You got ermine. Royalty? You were basically a walking zoo. Hats were essential, and the bigger, the better. Some women's hats were so tall they looked like they were trying to make contact with aliens. Jewelry wasn't just for decoration. It was a status symbol. The more bling you had, the more people knew you were important. Think of it as the medieval version of flashing your designer labels. Clothing was often embroidered with family crests or religious symbols. It was like wearing your heart on your sleeve, but with more thread and fewer emotions. Despite all the layers, medieval clothing wasn't washed very often. So, while everyone looked fabulous, they probably smelled like a combination of BO and mothballs. Medieval fashion, where the stink outweighed the style. 9. Trials by ordeal, justice, medieval style. In the Middle Ages, the legal system was a bit unconventional. Instead of trials, they had ordeals. Because nothing says fair trial like setting someone on fire. Trial by fire involved holding a red-hot iron or walking across burning coals. If your wounds healed cleanly, you were innocent. If not, well, better luck in the afterlife. Trial by water was a favorite for suspected witches. They'd throw you into a pond, and if you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, but also drowned. So, lose-lose? Trial by combat was basically medieval UFC. Two people would fight it out, and whoever won was obviously telling the truth. Because who needs evidence when you've got a sword? The church got in on the action with the ordeal of the cross. Accused people had to stand with their arms outstretched in a cross position. First one to drop their arms was guilty. It was like a medieval game of Simon Says, but with higher stakes. If you were accused of theft, you might have to undergo the ordeal of hot water, where you'd reach into boiling water to grab a stone. If you succeeded, you were innocent. If you failed, well, at least you had a good reason to scream. Some ordeals were even weirder, like trial by cake. The accused had to eat a piece of consecrated cake. If they choked, they were guilty. If not, they got dessert. The idea behind trials by ordeal was that God would intervene to show who was innocent. So, if you ever needed divine intervention, this was the time to pray hard. Despite the obvious flaws, trials by ordeal were surprisingly popular. Because why wouldn't you trust your life to a system that's basically medieval fear factor? Eventually, people realized that burning, drowning, and fighting weren't the best ways to determine guilt, so trials by ordeal were phased out. But not before making everyone seriously reconsider their life choices. 10. Medieval hygiene, or why everyone smelled like a barn. Bathing was a rare luxury in the Middle Ages. Most people believed that bathing too often was unhealthy, so they avoided it like the plague, literally. When people did bathe, they often used the same bathwater for the whole family. So, if you were last in line, you basically took a bath in dirty, lukewarm soup. Public bathhouses were popular, but they were more like medieval spas/social clubs. You could relax, get a massage, and, if you were feeling fancy, maybe catch a venereal disease. Teeth brushing was practically non-existent. People used twigs or rags to clean their teeth, but mostly, they just hoped for the best and avoided smiling. People thought that bad smells could protect them from illness, so they carried around scented pouches or flowers. It was like medieval Febreze, but without the effectiveness. Laundry was a big chore, so people didn't do it often. Clothes were worn until they were practically walking on their own, and then they were finally washed, if they were lucky. Perfume was popular among the wealthy to cover up the stench. The poor just embraced their natural musk, which probably attracted more flies than admirers. Medieval toilets were a nightmare. If you were lucky, you had a chamber pot. If not, you had a latrine, a hole in the ground that smelled like a barnyard on a hot day. Flies and lice were a constant problem, and most people just accepted that they were part of daily life. It was like having a free pet, but one that's always biting you. Despite the lack of hygiene, people in the Middle Ages had surprisingly good immune systems, probably because they were constantly exposed to all kinds of germs and bacteria. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? 11. Medieval food. When eating was a daily adventure. The medieval diet was heavy on bread, porridge, and stew. It was the age of carbs, and more carbs. Keto? Never heard of it. Meat was a luxury, and when people did eat it, it was often heavily salted or smoked to preserve it. So, if you liked your food extra salty and a little chewy, medieval cuisine was right up your alley. Spices were a big deal, and were used to cover up the taste of food that was questionable, because if your meat smells a bit off, just add some cinnamon and pretend it's fine. Fish was a staple, especially on Fridays when eating meat was a no-go. But medieval fish wasn't exactly fresh. It was more like fish jerky. Yum. Vegetables were considered food for the poor. The rich preferred meat, but they ate vegetables too, just as a garnish, not the main event. People drank a lot of ale and beer because the water was often unsafe to drink. So, technically, everyone was a little buzzed all the time. Cheers to that. Sweets were a rare treat. Honey was the primary sweetener, and sugar was a luxury item. So, if you were lucky enough to get a sweet treat, you savored every bite. Feasts were a big deal, especially for the rich. They were like medieval food festivals, complete with roasted peacocks, whole pigs, and enough food to feed a small village. Table manners were interesting. People ate with their hands, and wiping your mouth on the tablecloth was totally acceptable. Forks? Who needs them? Leftovers weren't wasted. They were often turned into pies or stews for the next day. Because in the Middle Ages, you didn't let anything go to waste, except, hygiene. 12. The Magna Carta. When England invented the fine print. In 1215, King John of England was forced to sign the Magna Carta by a group of rebellious barons. It was like a medieval contract negotiation, except with more swords and fewer lawyers. The Magna Carta is often hailed as the first step towards democracy, but at the time, it was really just a way for the barons to protect their own interests. Democracy came later, much later. One of the key points of the Magna Carta was that the king couldn't just throw people in prison for no reason. It was like the medieval version of "you can't sit with us," but with jail time. The Magna Carta also included a clause about not raising taxes without the consent of the barons. So, basically, it was the barons telling the king to stop dipping into their wallets. The document originally had 63 clauses, covering everything from the rights of the church to the treatment of debtors. It was like a medieval terms and conditions that nobody actually read. The Magna Carta didn't just protect the barons, it also had some clauses that benefited commoners. But let's be real, it was mostly about the barons keeping their power. Despite its importance, the Magna Carta was annulled by the Pope just a few months after it was signed. Because nothing says rule of law like having it overruled by a guy in Rome. The Magna Carta was reissued several times over the years, each time with some changes. So, it was like a medieval software update, bug fixes and all. The most famous clause of the Magna Carta, the right to a fair trial, is still a cornerstone of legal systems today. So, next time you're in court, you can thank some angry medieval barons for that. The Magna Carta didn't solve all of England's problems, but it did set the stage for future legal reforms. And it gave King John a massive headache, which was a win for everyone else.